Welcome back again. Today we're going to be talking about research ethics, which is the second major topic in our class. As a college student, you could take an entire course in the field of ethics. Ethics is an area of philosophy, and ethics has to do with issues of right and wrong. If you're taking a course in ethics, you would spend some time debating issues of right and wrong and listening to different people's opinions. And in a certain situation, an action is considered ethical if it doesn't do any unnecessary harm, and an action is considered unethical if it does do unnecessary harm. And in this topic, we're going to be talking about ethical issues in the context of research, or research with human participants. We're going to talk about what a researcher has to do to do a study that's considered ethical or ethically acceptable. We're going to talk about what a researcher has to do to treat participants with dignity and respect, and what a researcher has to do to avoid unnecessary harm. We're also going to talk about what a researcher has to do to avoid treating people like objects to be experimented on. And this video will have a few different sections. First, I want to give a brief overview of the history of research ethics. I want you to see how ethical standards have changed over time in research with human participants. The ethical standards that we follow today in research with humans weren't always followed, and several unethical studies were done in the past. So unethical research was more common back in the past before we had the standards that we follow today. So, but actually, before we move any further, I want to pose a question to all of you. I want to pose a question just like I did at the beginning of our last topic. So the question I want to have you think about is, what does it mean to treat people ethically? Well, if I asked you this question in person, you might say that it means to treat people with dignity and respect. You might say that it means to treat people the way you would want to be treated. You might also say that it means avoiding any unnecessary harm to other people. And those answers would all be correct. Those are all different pieces of this concept of ethical. And the next question I want you to think about is, what makes a research study ethical? What makes a research study ethically acceptable and not bad, basically? Well, if I asked you this question, you might say that a researcher has to get consent from each participant. In other words, you might say that a researcher has to get each participant's voluntary agreement before bringing the person into a study. You might say that a researcher can't force someone to be in a study if they don't really want to be, and that's one part of what makes a study ethical. A researcher has to recruit participants who are willing volunteers and people who aren't forced to be there. You can't hold people against their will. You might also say that it means avoiding any unnecessary danger during the study. You might say it means avoiding risk of physical or psychological harm as much as possible. And that answer would also be correct. That's another part of doing ethical research. So the answer to this question, what makes a study ethical, is complex. There's not just one correct answer. It involves lots of different things. So now I want to move ahead and talk a little bit about the history of research ethics. If you're a psychology major, you can probably think of several examples of unethical psychology experiments that were done in the past. Right now, I can think of Milgram, the shock experiment, and Zimbardo, the Stanford prison study. Those are two studies people often learn about in Psych 1, their first psychology class. But there are also many less famous unethical studies that were done in past times that I'd like to talk about. So I'd like for us to go back in time to the early 1900s during World War II. During World War II, a series of unethical or dangerous medical experiments was done with prisoners in concentration camps, and these people who were held captive in the concentration camps were experimented on in dangerous ways, and several people were harmed during these experiments. And a few years later, a study was done with syphilis patients, and this study was done over several decades. And in this study, the syphilis patients were denied any type of treatment for their condition. And even when new treatments became available during the course of the study, these participants were denied access to those new treatments. And I mentioned that this study took place over several decades. So during the study, some participants became desperate for treatment and actually left the study when they weren't supposed to, and sought out treatment from outside doctors. And it turns out that these participants who escaped were discovered by the researchers and were actually brought back into the study. And these types of unethical studies I'm describing gained so much attention that the federal government stepped in. The federal government created a task force with the job of creating a document that would list out the major ethical rules or principles that need to be followed in research with human participants. And the document that this group created is called the Belmont Report. And the Belmont Report is actually the document that's followed in current times today in research with human participants. And right now, I want to go over the 3 ethical principles that are listed out in that Belmont Report. So we're going to be talking about the 3 ethical principles that researchers have to follow in modern research with humans. So the 3 Belmont principles are called respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. I want to define each of these and also provide at least one example for each one. So the first principle is respect for persons. This principle says that people should be able to freely decide whether to participate in research. This principle basically says that participants' free will needs to be respected. A researcher can't force people to do things that they don't want to do. And I need to make sure that you're clear on what this wording means. So in this context, respect for persons doesn't mean that researchers need to treat people with respect in general. It's not saying that researchers need to be polite or anything like that. It has a more specific meaning. Respect for persons is saying that researchers need to respect participants' free will, which is it's a certain type of respect. And a researcher has to do 2 things to follow this principle. So first, a researcher has to get something called informed consent from each participant. A researcher has to get each participant's agreement to be in the study. Before a researcher can bring a person into a study and have them participate, the researcher has to inform them of what they're getting into, inform them of all of the important details, including risks and benefits, and then ask the person, do you still want to participate? And if the person says yes, then the person is giving informed consent because the person was informed about what they're getting into, and now they've willingly consented. So that's the first thing that needs to be done for this principle to be followed. Also, a researcher can't force a participant to remain in a study if they want to drop out. If a person wants to drop out, they have to be able to drop out without any negative consequences. So if you get informed consent from each participant and you also let people drop out if they want to drop out, you're following this principle of respect for persons. And I can think of one famous example of a study that violated this principle. And you might be thinking of the same study that I am. It's the Stanford Prison Experiment. So I believe back in the 1970s at Stanford University, they did a study in which one group of people played the role of prisoners and another group played the role of guards in a fake prison. And this experiment lasted for, I think, a week. And what they did was, at Stanford University, they turned the basement of the psychology department into a fake prison, and then they went out and recruited participants on campus. What they actually did was, what the researchers actually did was pretended to be police officers and arrested people as if they actually had a warrant for that person, and then they brought them into the experiment. And then each participant was randomly assigned to be a prisoner or a guard. And the participants, some of the participants wanted to leave early because the behavior of the guards was getting so out of control. But these people who wanted to leave were held captive for at least a few days. even though they didn't want to be there. So the respect for persons principle was definitely violated in this study. The second principle is beneficence. This principle says that research should do more good than harm. This principle is pretty straightforward. This principle is basically saying that researchers should aim to help people and to help society, and they should also avoid harming people as much as possible. It might help to imagine a scale with red checkers on the left side and black checkers on the right side. And imagine that the red checkers are all of the benefits that have come from research over time. And imagine that the black checkers are all of the harm that's been caused by research over time. So if you looked at the red checkers, you might see some major benefits like cures for diseases. You might also see some less important benefits like supporting a certain theory or making a discovery that's interesting, but that's still a benefit. And if you looked at the black checkers, you would see some major harm, like maybe what might have happened in a highly unethical experiment. And you might see some more minor harm, like there might be one black checker that says that a person got a headache from looking at a computer screen while memorizing a recall list, but that still counts as a harm. And what this principle of beneficence is saying that over time, the red checkers need to be heavier than the black checkers. The scale needs to tip in the direction of the red checkers, and there needs to be more good being done than harm over time in research. The third principle is the principle of justice. So this principle says that the people who are supporting a research study need to be in a position to benefit from the results of the study down the line. And whenever a study is done with human participants, there's always some people who are supporting the study and helping the researcher complete the study. For example, the participants are helping the researcher by volunteering their time and energy. Also, some studies have funding, and people are donating their money to support the study. This principle is saying that these people who are supporting the research need to be in a position where they could possibly benefit from the results down the line. If a researcher does a study and gathers support from people who could never benefit from the results, then that violates this principle of justice, because in that situation, the researcher is basically using people, and that's not just. That wouldn't be considered justice. And I'll share just a few examples so you get this idea down. And the first example I like to share is a study in which medications are tested on prisoners or inmates who would never be able to take the medication in the future, because as an inmate, they're not allowed access to that medication. That would violate the principle of justice, because if this medication does turn out to be effective, the prisoners who had the medicine tested on them would never be able to actually use it and benefit from it. So I think that's a pretty concrete example. I'd like to also share a couple of less formal examples. So I thought of another example involving a workplace situation. Imagine that a company wants to test out a new training program that they've developed, and they look around the company and look for people who have enough time on their hands to complete this training program, and they decide to recruit people who were 65 and about to retire to complete this training program because they don't have much left to do. They have a lot more time on their hands. That would violate this principle, because if this training program turns out to benefit employees, these people won't see those benefits because they'll be retired and they won't be working there anymore. These people will be supporting the researcher by participating in this training program that's being tested out. But if the training program turns out to be effective and it actually works, they won't see the benefits of that. And I also want to share maybe just one more example. So imagine that a certain person wants to find out how to improve campus life at a university. And this person goes to a certain university and interviews college students at that university, asking for their thoughts on how the campus life could be improved at that university. And after the interviews are done, the researcher takes off and goes to another university and actually makes those changes at the other university to improve their campus life. But the people who were interviewed at the other campus never actually see those changes. They never actually see any of the benefits that they suggested as well as part of the interview. That would violate justice because these college students are supporting the researcher by being in the interview and providing suggestions for how to improve campus life, but then those benefits are taken somewhere else. So hopefully that helps you understand these three principles. In the next part of the video, we'll talk about the group of people who supervises human subjects research at a university to make sure that it's being done ethically.